the topic of my talk is exploring workplace creativity through corpus linguistics. And as Geraldine has already indicated, what I'm going to talk about today is based on a forthcoming book that I'm very excited to be hopefully publishing soon, together with Mike Hanford in the Routledge Applied Corpus Linguistics series. And as this is something I'm, of course, immersed in at the moment, and when Geraldine asked me to give a talk, I thought, obviously, this research network is concerned with corpus linguistics and variety. I thought the question, it would be interesting to look at the question of whether, to what extent you can actually explore creativity through corpus linguistics. So I'm going to start with kind of, if you like, the kind of theoretical model that we've come up with for exploring creativity in workplace contexts, which in itself is not specifically linked to corpus linguistics, but then I'll go on to talk about the exploring workplace creativity through corpus linguistics and give you a few examples. So obviously, if you're going to talk about creativity, you need a definition. So the definition we're using actually comes out of organizational studies, because we've also tried to kind of see what people have been doing in kind of management theory, organizational studies in researching creativity. And as we're looking at workplace discourse, workplace corpora, this is quite a useful definition. So creativity is defined by Amabile as involving the generation of ideas or outcomes that are not only novel, but also appropriate to some goal. So, of course, often creativity is thought of in terms of the art, something creative as being something new, something original. But within organizational studies, the idea is that it should not only, something that's creative should not only be new, but it should also have some value. It should be appropriate to some task or goal. And a second important point in exploring creativity in workplace context is that, of course, what is considered creative, so what is novel and also useful within a community of practice, can vary. So the other important consideration is that we have to consider or interpret creativity in the context of a particular community, a particular community of practice. Okay, so I'm sure you're all familiar with the notion of community of practice, initially developed by Wenger, which is determined by these three characteristics: mutual engagement, joint enterprise, and a shared repertoire. In terms of exploring creativity, of course, when I say we're trying to take into account what's been done within organizational studies, often, in most cases actually, those approaches really don't consider language at all. If they consider communication, then you're really lucky, but language is really not usually part of the investigation. But of course, as linguists, as discourse analysts, that's what we're interested in. So in terms of exploring creativity, we're drawing very much on previous research done on linguistic creativity and creative discourse. In particular, one of our big sources of inspiration was the book by Ron Carter on language and creativity. So originally published 2004, and then the second edition in 2016. And we're also drawing on the work of Jones, who has explored creative discourse, which he contrasts to linguistic creativity. So whereas linguistic creativity is using language creatively, Jones says creative discourse is creative ways of getting things done through language. So those kind of two aspects of creativity related to language and discourse were our starting points for the theoretical side of how do we approach creativity in workplace contexts in terms of the discourse. So we're also very much drawing on Ron Carter's idea of ordinary creativity. Like Carter, we're looking at spoken language. So another important special distinction is that, again, in contrast to the kind of, if you like, everyday concept of creativity of, you know, the lone genius, the individual coming up with these unique creative ideas. In discourse, of course, we have people speaking to each other, and so the focus is not so much on individual creativity, although that could be a focus as well, but on whether there's such a thing as group creativity that might be jointly created. So that's also very much our focus. And I love this quote from Carter, that linguistic creativity is not simply a property of exceptional people, but an exceptional property of all people. So again, we're not, on the whole, the kind of creativity we are looking at is not breakthrough creativity, as is sometimes studied in the context of organizational studies, where we're looking for novel, new inventions, breakthrough ideas that then get implemented into new products. What we're looking at is kind of more small-scale creativity in the context of a particular interaction, or in some cases, even something that will lead to creative outcomes after that interaction is finished. Okay, so in terms of linguistic creativity, what kinds of things are we looking for? So again, drawing on previous research, the types of language that have been found to be potentially creative include, most obviously, I guess, figurative language, so things like metaphor, proverbs, hyperbole, euphemism. Carter also talks about sound patterning, so this kind of creativity, which is very much akin to creativity in poetry, so repetition, alliteration, onomatopoeia, rhyme. And Carter shows how in conversation you get these kinds of patterns as well, which are typically considered to be the remit of literary uses. And then, of course, lexical choice, in particular neologisms or playing with words. So an example from our data, this was from a meeting in a startup where E&D are the co-founders. And they use this extended metaphor of a floating or a sinking ship, actually, to talk about how this meeting took place in February, how the company's been doing financially. And as you can see, their assessment is not very optimistic, but they're also kind of joking about it. So at one point, they say, is that like floating? No, it's probably underfloating. That's underfloating. That's sinking. And then I have a little laugh. So you've got this extended metaphor, the floating sinking ship, and in addition to that, you also have this sound patterning through the repetition. So you have this kind of echoing and varying the metaphor here. Okay, creative discourse. Here the focus is not so much on creative language as such, but on creative ways of getting things done through discourse. So this could involve solving a problem in an original way, for example, through creative reframing, which I'll show you a couple of examples of in a minute. Or Jones talks about examples of drawing on different genres and combining them in a novel way. That's also an example of creative discourse. So here's an example of creative reframing from Alison Ray in discussing interactions between carers and people with dementia. And the example here is that the person with dementia does not want to cross a black doormat because it appears to be a dirty puddle on the ground. And then the carer, instead of, trying to be realistic and say, no, of course it's not a puddle, it's only a doormat, the carer decides to enter into the world of the person with dementia, and suggests walking round the mat. Yes, that does look a bit scary, so let's walk round it. So she creatively reframes the problem in the terms of the person with dementia. So we could consider this a creative way of performing a care duty. An example from our own data, or this particular example, is from an article I published together with Helena, or I'm hoping to publish together with Helena Lourova. From her own data, she collected, she analyzed meetings from the Chamber of Commerce and Industry in the UK. In this particular meeting, Doug, who's the deputy CEO, he's in a team meeting, and it's about meeting the targets. The team have been having trouble meeting the targets, and at this point, they're arguing that it's impossible. They can't do it. So the meetings come to an impasse. And then at this point, Doug suddenly says this: sorry, well, not necessarily. Well, yes, you can come up with a pile of strengths, but I mean, it's really, what can I do to help you guys help achieve the targets? And you know, let's think about possibly breaking the rules. This is an enormously bureaucratic, and if we can bypass the rules, break the rules, or ignore them, or throw them out, then we can achieve the outputs by doing so. That's fine. So here he makes a kind of radical proposal, but it's a hypothetical proposal to break the rules, bypass the rules, throw them out, which of course he can't possibly mean seriously. But what he's doing is reframing the situation hypothetically. He imagines this hypothetical scenario where you could throw out the rules. And this seems to then break the impasse, because after this, the team actually do start brainstorming some possible hypothetical ways of achieving the targets after all. And these are just some examples from different individual turns, where speakers make suggestions of what might be possible. So for example, I mean, one smaller issue which might be easy enough to put into place, or yeah, I think that might be an idea, etc. So, and in fact, I don't have time to go into detail here, but one of the things that we found for the book is that hypothesizing was frequently used as a creative strategy in problem solving. And so using these hypothetical scenarios was often one way of coming to, in situations that were difficult, where it was difficult to find a solution, to actually find a creative, let's say it was a creative device, if you like, discursive device, to try to arrive at a solution. Okay, and then the last, in addition to linguistic creativity and discursive creativity, in sort of the model that we came up with for visualizing creativity, we had a third dimension, alignment, which is about whether speakers converge or diverge in their attitude and relationship towards one another. Now, why is alignment relevant for creativity, or what has it got to do with creativity? Well, first of all, we thought, because we are looking at spoken discourse, it's a factor that's important. How do speakers align to one another? Are they on the same page? You know, are they agreeing, disagreeing? Do they have a close or a distant kind of stance or alignment towards each other at any point in the discourse? But in addition to that, drawing on our own observations, but also on the literature from organizational studies, a number of researchers have found that positive group affect, so more kind of on the macro level, democratic leadership, but on the more micro level, positive group affect can actually promote creative outcomes. And we did find that creativity often went hand in hand with convergent alignment, not always, but we felt this was an important additional element to take into account. And I'll talk about that a bit more later, how we even found instances where we thought alignment or converging with someone was actually used as a creative strategy. Okay, so that's kind of the theoretical part. Sorry, just another point on alignment. If you think back to those 3 examples that I gave you of linguistic creativity and discursive creativity. So for example 1, which was the floating sinking example, clearly here there's convergent alignment. The 2 speakers are joking, they're reinforcing each other. So here we have linguistic creativity and convergent alignment. In the second example, the dementia discourse, where the carer converges with the person with dementia in coming up with this creative frame for imagining, for solving the problem of getting around this puddle, as the person with dementia saw it. In the Chamber of Commerce and Industry meeting, at the point in the meeting where I showed you the example, there's very divergent alignment. There's disagreement. The meeting has come to an impasse, but then through the creative reframing, they then slowly move towards convergent alignment. So we try to represent this framework for creativity in a model of creative workplace discourse with kind of a 3-dimensional model. On the left, on the vertical axis, creative discourse, the horizontal axis, linguistic creativity, and kind of going back in space, alignment. So what we try to do is what we hopefully we demonstrated in the book is that you can plot any individual interaction in terms of these 3 factors, these 3 dimensions. So in this example here, where you have the 2 balls, you have the little squiggly ball there at the top, and then the squiggly. Sorry, you have the ball at the top, the squiggly arrow. So I don't know how to point. So I hope. Oh, hey, this is a pointer. Does that work? I don't know. No, I don't think so. But anyway, so this represents could represent a particular interaction, actually not a very good example, where at the beginning of the conversation you have very creative discourse, you have a lot of linguistic creativity, and the speakers are aligned. By the end of the conversation, there's low alignment, low linguistic creativity, and low creative discourse. So this is kind of the worst of all worlds, but it's just to show you how the model could work. Okay, so that was rather a long introduction to which in and of itself has nothing to do with corpus linguistics, but just to kind of show you where we're coming from and how we're conceptualizing creativity. So let's move on to creativity in corpus linguistics. So the question that I'm trying to answer is, can creativity be explored through corpus methods? Of course, my answer is going to be yes, otherwise I wouldn't be talking, right? But there are, of course, there are some problems, and it doesn't seem an obvious method to choose. Why is that? Well, of course, we all know that corpus methods are used specifically to identify frequent patterns. With creativity, we're talking about unusual and novel uses. So it doesn't seem to be, in a way, it doesn't seem to be the right method. Furthermore, creativity can, of course, take any form. So you can't, at least not yet, ask the computer to find creativity, instances of creativity. So we're suggesting that creativity can be explored through corpus methods using a computer-assisted discourse analysis, so a CADS approach. So not exclusively, because CADS, of course, is, so if it's a definition, so according to Partridge et al., CADS studies are concerned with the form and or function of language as communicative discourse, which incorporate the use of computerized corpora in their analyses. So the idea here is to start with discourse and then to support the investigation of that discourse with corpus methods. So that means corpus methods are applied flexibly when and as they are useful. And why are corpus methods useful, even if we're exploring something like creativity? Partington et al. Mentioned that CADs can help identify non-obvious meaning, so meaning that it might not readily be available to the naked eye, to naked eye perusal. And of course, as all corpus studies, even if we have smaller corpora, the findings, they allow us to come up with more robust findings because we're using a larger amount of data than just analyzing individual examples. We also see ourselves as within the Nottingham School of CADs, which has actually been defined by Anthony et al. And McHenry and Hardy. So very much inspired by the work of Ron Carter and Mike McCarthy, where the focus has been mainly on exploiting smaller and contextually rich corpora. So, for example, professional corpora such as CANBEC, the Cambridge and Nottingham Corpus of Business English, and my own very small, modest corpus, Abbott, the Corpus of American and British Office Talk. We would say this type of CADS method involves strategically employing corpus methods with a qualitative stance. And the qualitative stance is possible because the corpora we're using are small. They have a lot of contextual data. So it's always possible, so it's always fairly easy to go from the corpus finding something like a word list, keyword list, or concordance, to then go directly back to the data to see what's actually happening. Okay, so which corpora are we using? So the CANBEC, the Cambridge and Nottingham Corpus of Business English, which Mike Hanford compiled, 1 million words. My own small corpus of British and American Office Talk with just 34,000 words. I've already mentioned the Chamber of Commerce and Industry Corpus, which Helena Larova compiled, 125,000 words. And a corpus that I've compiled recently of nursing home interactions, NHC for short, which is about 53,000 words. And in the book, we also draw on other data sets, but these are the main corpora that we use. Okay, so how can corpus methods be used to investigate creativity? So both Mike Coey and Patrick Hans suggest that a corpus-informed approach can enable the typical or natural to be contrasted with the untypical and the potentially creative. So in a way, the first thing that we would want to do before we explore creativity is to explore the typical language of that particular corpus, that particular community of practice. And then we would look for creativity in the untypical, the anomalous, maybe the infrequent words. So we tend to think of corpus methods we tend to use corpus methods to find out about frequent things, right? Frequent items. But of course, you can also use corpus methods to look at the infrequent ones, and the corpus can tell you which words, expressions are frequent and which are not. One thing you can do then is, once you've got your word lists and keyword lists, you can, and once you've established what is typical, what is frequent for this particular corpus, you can then look at the things that are surprising, anomalous, perhaps unexpected. So Hanks actually suggests a number of steps for analyzing potentially creative words. So when, of course, not all infrequent items, in fact, most infrequent items aren't creative, but they're the ones that are perhaps potentially creative. Yeah, so the unexpected ones. So the first step, he says, is to identify the normal, central, and typical usage in the corpus. Then check if the remaining anomalous uses are instances of performance errors. And thirdly, if they are not performance errors, consider if they are deliberate irregularities that explain something about linguistic creativity. So an example from Canbeck is the word if, which turned out to be one of the top keywords in position 18. And that kind of stood out because it contrasts with obviously the frequency in other corpora, so in the reference corpus that was used. So why is if so frequent? And in fact, if we found was used in context, often used in context of creative problem solving in business meetings, not just in Canbeck, but in the other corpora as well. And you've already seen one example that I showed you where hypothetical scenarios, hypothesizing, is often a discursive creative strategy. And of course, hypothesizing is often done with if. So the example again here from the Chamber of Commerce team meeting, if we can bypass the rules, etc. So that's one example of how just starting with a keyword list, then looking at concordances, looking at discourse context, you can actually can lead you to discovering creative uses. So if in and of itself is not a creative linguistic item, but it can point to a discursive creativity. Okay, so what types of creativity can be investigated through corpus methods? The most obvious type is, of course, linguistic creativity, could be because here we may be talking about specific patterns. Of course, again, you can't ask the software programs to search for metaphors, but you can start with a pre-established list of metaphors or whatever the item is, hyperbole or neologisms that you want to investigate. And in fact, Alice Degnan has done this very successfully. So to search for terms from a list, for example, metaphors, and this list will be established through previous research. So previous research on, for example, metaphors or metaphors that are often used creatively. There is, of course, a limitation, as Degnan herself says, so the researcher will only uncover what he or she sets out to look for. And that's where, in addition to using this method where you have a list of items that you search for, actually scanning or perusing word lists and keyword lists and looking for unusual items would be a way of supplementing that method, because then you can find things you weren't expecting as well. Okay, so linguistic creativity seems the most obvious type of creativity that you could investigate through corpus methods. But I think you can also look at discursive creativity through the method I just mentioned. So potentially creative or atypical items could be identified initially through a word and keyword searches. So again, it might not be a creative word as such, but it could be an unusual word, something that seems atypical, that on further investigation might turn out to point to creative uses, as in the if example for hypothesizing. Okay, and finally, what about alignment? So based on the idea that alignment and creativity, so a close alignment and creativity often go together, if we look at frequent clusters or n-grams, many of them have an interpersonal function, such as or ablative. If we just take an example from Canbeck, the top 4 bigrams, we have a number of items here which could be used relationally, like I think, I mean, or let's say overall their main purpose is either to structure the discourse or some kind of relational function. And if we look again at our Chamber of Commerce example, the hypothetical scenario, here is introduced with this discourse marker, so let's think And indeed, these kinds of hypothetical scenarios are frequently introduced by interpersonal items like these. So the idea is that frequently used interpersonal markers, if you like, often occur in the context of creative uses, not always, of course. Okay, so in the last part of my talk, I want to go through a case study with you that that's from my nursing home, Corpus. It's a kind of a challenge because I think in a way a care home is probably the least conducive professional context you can maybe think of for creativity, besides maybe a factory floor. So it's not a very likely context for instances of creativity. Why is that? Well, because the interactions in elder care institutions are highly routinized, as has been established in previous research and as I found myself in the data that I investigated. So the challenge or the research question here is, do we find examples of creativity despite the constraints on the discourse imposed by the care routine? So what methods did we use? So first of all, just to remind you that creativity can only be determined in the context of the community of practice and its professional and discursive practices. So first, you need to establish what the typical professional and discursive practices are. And of course, corpus tools provide a very robust method for this because you can identify what the frequent words, keywords, phrases, and there's therefore also types of interaction are. The creative uses then will most likely be instances of language and discourse that depart from the typical linguistic and interactional characteristics of the care home. So the first step then was to find out what are the typical linguistic, discursive, interactional characteristics of the interaction in the care home. So just to quickly tell you about the background, the setting is a care home in England with residents who have dementia. Data were gathered by care workers and nurses carrying recording devices. There were also recording devices placed in fixed locations, but in fact, the data that was transcribed were all from the first type, where care workers or nurses had carried recording devices as they did their rounds. And it's all afternoon or morning or afternoon shifts, because the night shifts, there was not much talking. What kinds of interactions? So it was care workers and nurses looking after residents. That was the main type, of course, because those were the people doing the recordings. But the recordings also picked up co-workers interacting, so care workers, nurses, kitchen staff, also one or two interactions with the owner, care workers talking to relatives, and also phone calls to doctors, surgeries, and hospitals. Just a few corpus statistics, 70 hours of data of audio recorded overall. 11, the data transcribed, 11 recordings, so that was usually parts of shifts of half an hour to several hours from 5 care workers or nurses shifts. So 15 hours altogether, 53,000 words, which is a surprisingly small amount, but that's because there was a lot of silence. And this, again, has been found to be quite typical of care home interaction. So as already found in previous research on care homes, interactions in care homes are highly routinized and constrained. There are many routine tasks. Well, I wouldn't say many, but there are routine tasks which take a lot of time. So dressing residents, feeding, administering medication. And so there are, of course, time constraints, which also impacts on the nature of the communication. So findings from previous research were that communication is scarce. The nature of the communication is very task-oriented, and there are, of course, power asymmetries between residents and staff. Some of the interactional and linguistic characteristics that have been identified include the presence of control acts, directives, imperatives, where residents are told or asked to do certain things. Linked to that, inquiries and requests, simplified structures in terms of lexis, phonology, and syntax. Terms of endearment, so-called elder speak, which in previous research, particularly by Granger, have been interpreted quite negatively as being demeaning, involving infantilization, and as not being used in an authentically relational way, but in order to achieve compliance. Collective plural nouns, we, so instead of, could you do this, we'll do this. Brief interaction, short turns, and also silence, task performed without verbal interaction. And now I found many of these characteristics in my own data as well, not all of them. I don't have time to talk about all of this, but for example, I didn't find the collective plural noun we as an example of elder speak, but many of the others were indeed confirmed, and I'll as indeed was confirmed through Corpus methods to a large extent. So what methods did I use? I used the word list and the keyword list using Wordsmith Tools 8.0. And the reference corpora I used were the social and intimate subcorpus of CanCode, so the Cambridge and Nottingham corpus of discourse in English, which make up 2.7 million words, and CAMBEC, the Cambridge and Nottingham corpus of business English. Now, those are two quite different reference corpora, but I decided to use them both for different reasons. So the social and intimate subcorpus of CanCode, I decided to use that because what's interesting about this data is when you look at the language, it doesn't look like any other kind of workplace that I've looked at, because you have a lot of pseudo-intimate language. You have a lot of language that looks like social or intimate language, but of course it's not. It's in a professional context. So that comparison was interesting. And then I also used CAMBEC in order to see how this professional context contrasted with more typical, if you like, business language. Okay, so if we look at some of the findings, among the top 10 words, mostly you get the things you would expect to find, especially in a spoken corpus, that you and I are very frequent, although interestingly, you is the most frequent word, whereas for example, in the social and intimate corpus, it's I, but both I and you are frequent. However, what immediately stands out is two lexical words, so name in position 3 and resident in position 5, because for most corpora, the lexical word, you don't get any lexical words till much, much further down the list. Now, why were name and resident so frequent? Well, it's because resident name was the anonymization code used when a particular resident was referred to by name. So it's not something that was actually said. However, it does show us that one of the characteristics of the care home was for the carers and for the staff to talk about the residents. So that was, in terms of the word list, one key finding. If we look a bit further down the word list, so this is positions 22 to 34, you can see that there are a number of imperatives: do, come, don't. So here we find evidence for the use of control acts, as found in previous research, that there are a lot of instances of people being asked or told what to do. If we look at the keyword list, this is just a summary of the types of items found among the top 50 keywords. So again, the keyword list confirmed the frequency of control acts like come, sit, hold. Also, terms of endearment, so elder speak, ? So words like darling, love, to address the residents. But also, and this was something not found, or at least perhaps also not looked for in previous research, the presence of a lot of interactional and relational language, including greetings, so hello, and then terms for politeness like thank you, please, sorry, positive evaluative adjectives, lovely, nice, and laughter as well. In terms of lexis, so looking at all the positively keywords, there were several categories that into which the most frequent lexical items fit. Food and eating, because a lot of the interactions involved feeding routines. So you had words like lunch, pudding, dinner, cup, tea, drink, eat, mouth. Vocabulary to do with medical concerns, infection, tablet, GP, doctor. And as I mentioned already, relational language. So terms of endearment and politeness markers. Okay, here's an example from a feeding routine where you can see all of this type of vocabulary being used. So you've got care worker who's got the number 12, and a care worker, another care worker who's just labeled as care worker female 1, and then a resident, that's R1. Come on, darling, resident name. Open up for me, darling. Lovely. Nice chicken, mashed potatoes, carrots and peas. Oh, wonderful. So you can see here this food vocabulary, chicken, mashed potatoes, carrots, peas. You've got the control acts, come on, open up. And you have this relational or pseudo-relational language, lovely, oh, wonderful. So if we look at the relational language in this extract, it very much confirms what Granger found, that it's maybe not really relational language, but it's used in the context or in the service of performing a care task. And that you could even say it's the reason for using it is to achieve compliance. So if we then ask, well, what about, so these are the characteristics of the interaction of the language, mostly confirming what was found in previous research. Well, is there any room for creativity? What about creativity? Are there instances of language or discourse that stand out from these frequent and typical uses and could therefore involve creativity? And secondly, if task focus, asymmetry, and the use of control acts characterize most interactions, perhaps discourse that is more relationally focused and more symmetrical might be considered creative. So maybe, what I'm suggesting is in the context of this particular community of practice, maybe any kind of authentically relational language will actually be an instance of creativity because it's so unusual. It's not the usual way of doing things. So related to that, as we saw that a lot of this relational language is actually used in the service of task-related interactions. The question is that always the case? Is every use of an evaluative adjective or a term of endearment, is it, kind of pseudo use? Is it part of a task routine? Or are there examples where it's truly relational? Could these perhaps be considered creative? Okay, so in terms of what we did to try and identify potentially creative words and expressions in this data collection, following methods we already used for other corpora, we decided we looked at those items that were fit into the category of linguistic creativity, so metaphors and idioms. Euphemisms, that's another category that's been investigated. So of course, we're only investigating those items that, that were actually found. So those first two, metaphors and idioms, euphemisms, these are categories of potentially creative items that have been identified as often having creative uses in previous research. The next two, terms of endearment, such as darling, and evaluative expressions, which did include hyperbole, such as wonderful and disgusting. These expressions I looked for because they are at least potentially relational in use and purpose. And therefore, I thought they could possibly point to more creative uses in this community of practice where there is apparently so little time for any kind of relational engagement. Okay, now metaphors and idioms, there were very, very few compared to other data we looked at, for example, Canbeck or the Abbott corpus. But there were some examples, but exclusively between co-workers, which is perhaps not surprising if you bear in mind that the residents had dementia, and therefore, using figurative language is probably, communication is difficult anyway, and using figurative language probably even more so. So this is here's quite a nice example between one of the nurses, she was actually a trainee nurse, and the owner, where the trainee nurse was sent down to the office to pick up some photos, but then the owner had no idea which photos they were. And so the she here is the person who sent the nurse. So I'll just read this. Yeah, I don't know what she wanted me to do. Lost the plot. She's lost the plot. So here we've got this metaphor. Lost the plot, lose the plot, which is doubly creative in a way. First of all, you have this kind of patterning, the echoing, but also you've got a kind of play on words on losing the photo, losing the plot. So this is, I think, one of the kind of rarer examples of creative metaphor use. There are a few others, but I say mostly between co-workers, and a lot of them also as part of relational sequences where co-workers are having a break. Okay, let's look at terms of endearment. So the question is, are they always examples of elder speak, as we saw in that feeding example, or are they ever genuinely relational? So darling was the most frequent one, but there are other ones as well. Now, obviously, terms of endearment are not really creative as such, but as they may signal intimacy and bring about a closer alignment in the context of this community of practice, I thought they could point to creative uses. So if we look at darling, it's ranked 10th most key word, and there are 90 occurrences. And of those 90 occurrences, there were only 9 that I thought that were used outside of care routines in what I would call relational sequences. So these are examples where the use was not part of a care routine. It might have happened during a care routine, but where clearly it was the term word darling wasn't used in order to, kind of in connection with a control act, but just to kind of interact with the carer. And interestingly, there were also some reciprocal uses where it was actually the resident who initiated, who used darling first. And this is a really nice example where a resident and the carer sing to each other and both use terms of endearment. So the resident says or sings, hello, darling, and laughs. And then the carer reciprocates, well, hello, sweetheart, also singing. So this, I would say, really represents creative discourse in the context of this community of practice. It's also linguistically creative. We get the sound patterning through the singing, the reciprocal use of terms of endearment. But it's also creative, I think, because here we have an example of a relational sequence of actual alignment breaking out of the care routine, which is really quite unusual. And we could even say that the carer, although I'm not arguing that this is conscious, uses alignment as a creative strategy, as actually a creative way of performing the work, if you bear in mind that the purpose of a care home is not just to, feed and dress and put residents to bed, but it's also to provide an environment that should be pleasant, should be conducive, should provide some kind of quality of life. So I think in terms of this community of practice, this kind of interaction can be seen as quite creative. Not only because it's unusual, but also a creative way of performing a care duty. Okay, I see I've talked much longer than I should have, but luckily this is my conclusion slide now. So to conclude, can corpus methods be used to investigate creativity? Yes. My answer is yes. Hopefully I've convinced you that corpus methods can help identify potentially creative items, and potentially creative is the important term here, because of course you always have to investigate the item in the linguistic context to find out if it really is being used creatively. But we could start with frequent and infrequent words and keywords, engrams, concordances. And a useful method here is to compare frequent and typical uses with infrequent and atypical, and therefore potentially creative uses. There are, of course, limitations. Quantitative methods must be complemented with qualitative ones. It's ultimately, of course, a matter of interpretation, whether a term is used creatively or not, and the term has to be looked at in its discourse context. Furthermore, this CADS method really works best with small specialized corpus, where the researcher remains very close, where you have a lot of rich data, and the researcher remains very close to the data and can access the discourse context very easily. Okay, so that brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your attention.